The idea of an electric city transit system had been cuffed around by City Council before that final decision to take the plunge passed in 1911. There were heated arguments as to whether the system should be publicly or privately operated. Other opinions to the contrary, I'm convinced it became a public operation because all the private interests that considered it thought better of it, so the city fathers really had no choice. I have vivid personal memories of those little four-wheel trolleys, very happy memories. From home, at 356 20th Street, we could see a car going west on Princess and have time to walk down while it went to the end of the line at 24th Street and turned back. Alternate cars making the East End loop operated in opposite directions, meeting at a passing track at about 3rd Street on Victoria. Going to my grandparents in the 200 block on 6th Street, I knew that if the car turned south off Rosser onto 6th Street, I had only 2 blocks to go. But if it continued east on Rosser, I would really get my nickel's worth. Of the kindly motorman who would stop in front of the house, instead of insisting on going to the regulation stop, I only remember one by name, Mr. Selby. Halloween night was a hard shift for those motormen. The big kids would haul dray wagons and huge boxes out and blockade the tracks. The best us little kids could do was pull the rope that hung down at the back of the car to pull the trolley pole off the wire. I remembered this trick many years later, when a Winnipeg motorman on a late-night car to the suburbs decided he wouldn't miss a traffic light to pick up a lone airman. As I boarded the car, I told him, "I think your trolley's off." The last streetcar ground to a halt in the car barn at 1st Street and College Avenue the evening of April 30th, 1932. All the future held for the city's pride were brief terms for the car bodies as cabins in the tourist camp where the Twin Pines Motel now stands, and then briefly sitting beside Victoria Avenue at the present location of the RCMP office, as parts of Brandon's first drive-in restaurant, the Train Drive-In. After 1932, the taxpayers would spend 20 years completing their payments. After pondering the records, I must come to one simple conclusion. Brandon just wasn't big enough to sustain such a system. There is a bright sidelight, however. Of all the grandiose schemes our city fathers have put us in hock for, this one was probably used and enjoyed by more ordinary citizens than any other.
Out on the prairies along the banks of the muddy Assiniboine River, a small settlement would pop up after a land deal gone sour and a series of misunderstandings. So was the accidental founding of the city of Brandon. Never considered a town from its inception, Brandon would be considered a city, the Wonder City of the Northwest, the home of a rail division point and the place where our story would find its beginnings and its end. I'm Sean Cameron. I'm an avid historian, and growing up in Brandon, I always heard talk about the good old days. Flares of neon on Rosser Avenue, wondrous architecture, long-lost storefronts, and the skeletal remains of a street railway system sprawling all over the ever-growing city, my home. We will trace back through history and put together some of the missing pieces in a long, untold story. We'll talk to local historians, dig up documents long forgotten, and seek out the remains of one of the last Brandon streetcars, a piece of our history. With good friend Nate Bauer by my side, we would embark on our journey in the fall of 2012. Knowing it was a tremendous task ahead of us, we made stops with some local historians to dig a bit deeper into the lore that was Brandon at the time. Both Tom Mitchell, the retired archivist from Brandon University, and Robert Booth, a local historian, would help us with the initial stages of our journey. We would learn how a rough and tumble community would aspire to adopt such a cosmopolitan idea like the street railway system. both would tie together strings of information and testimonials of the day to paint a fairly vivid picture of Brandon after the turn of the century.
The first street railway, or the first street railways, appeared in the 1880s, mostly in larger centers. One in 1905, 1906, a company called the Kensington Land and Development Corporation. They wanted to build a street railway, an electric railway, streetcars, 15 miles south to Lake Clemente. So the idea was floating around, and Brandon, from 1900 through to the end of the decade, like so many places in North America, particularly Canada, was going through a dramatic transformation, phenomenal growth. So by 1910, there was a consensus that had emerged within the community that the city needed a street railway. Everybody had one, so it's our turn. And in fact, if you looked around places like Hamilton, Toronto, Guelph, Barrie, Winnipeg, they all had a street railway. So any self-respecting urban center had to have a street railway.
Many residents of the day felt the railway was the jewel of any self-respecting city. At the time, it was considered the thing to do. If the bigger centers throughout Canada could have one, then truly the question was, why not Brandon? Before the citizens would be put to the polls on it, City Council had already begun sifting through offers as well as construction, and when faced with what many felt would be decades of stellar growth, the question was raised, why not consider the option? But when the question of ownership would arise and whether the ratepayer would be saddled with the debt, many eased off on the demands of their city. The embattled camps would swing back and forth before the question would finally be put to a plebiscite in the early 1900s. In the end, with tremendously low voter turnout, they would choose to put the cost on someone else's shoulders and not the taxpayer of the day. Beaten but not defeated, the pro-street railway camp would soldier on and dig deeper in their cause, while a bigger question was looming. After all, wasn't this the thing to do for the little Chicago of the North?
The railway or tram cars, and there's a mixture of street railways or tram cars. Where I grew up in England, they were always called tram cars and we called them the trams. Here that name is intermingled between trams and street railways and light railways. They're all similar things. If you look at Brandon in the early days, it must have been quite a smelly city to be. There must have been 50 stables downtown. One stable at least had 51 horses in it. And you could either rent them or you use them. And the streets weren't paved. They certainly weren't paved with gold, which a lot of the settlers believed. And so in the spring or after snowstorms, it would be a mixture of mud and feces from the animals. Also downtown, there was 4 or 5 slaughterhouses. They are currently dress shops and restaurants, but they usually actually kill beef in those places and cut them up, bring them downtown and cut them up, which also made mud.
One thing many residents of the city didn't realize at the time was a question that was looming on a much larger global scale. As the proposals would trade back and forth over the tables of council as well as city's management, a half a world away, actions were in place to turn the world upside down as the First World War was in its infancy. Canada had been burdened with a stagnant economy, and a pre-war recession was weighing heavy on the bottom line of the community and its residents. Back in Manitoba, though, the talk of war had not settled in, as the Dominion Fair was poised to pay a visit to the Wheat City. While many struggled to make ends meet, others would throw caution to the wind and begin preparing to host the Dominion, with a bright and shiny new city rail system carting thousands of passengers a day to the exhibition.
Consensus wasn't an easy thing to get in municipal politics in Brandon. Still isn't. But it was clear by the reports in the press that City Council, all members of Council, and broadly within the community, including the labor community, which was playing an increasing role in municipal affairs in the city, that this was an important initiative, and it should be taken. The big question was, should it be a municipally owned and operated system, or should it be private? That was the big question. And in November 1911, the question was put to a vote, and those supporting the municipally owned approach were defeated badly. Only 30% of the ratepayers actually voted. Council had been entertaining a proposal from J.D. McGregor, who was a major player in a variety of business interests in Brandon. And McGregor had submitted a proposal in October of 1911, about the time that Mayor Fleming had driven the famous first spike of the street railway. And this was Monday, I think it was October 11th. And the idea here was that the city would undertake to lay track, because they were paving streets and you didn't want to dig the streets up and lay track. They would collaborate with who held the franchise, if that's the route they went. So they began actual construction in 1911.
As talk of adventure would eventually send many overseas to their demise, talk of adventure in the Wild West would bring a group of young men from London to man a new fleet of streetcars through a cold and icy first winter full of both mishaps and successes.
All of the motormen were English. All the railroad tracks were Polish and Russian, I believe, and all the high wire above that powered the tram cars were American, as far as I can remember. The motormen, of course, were trained and were just invited over here. Everybody wanted to come here, and you were offered a better lifestyle, so they took a whole group for. Now, I don't know if they came from London. There was more than London that had motormen, but I suspect they would come from London, because London wasn't the greatest place to live. Even if you're a motorman, it was very poverty-stricken. And so they'd come out here because they were told by the railroad companies that this was a great place to come. And so they came. Well, they started in June, I believe it was, June the 5th, and that would be perfect. They did crash a few, they took the corners too fast, but the streetcars here, and Winnipeg had streetcars as well. Winnipeg had horse-drawn streetcars to start off with. We never did. We always had motorized ones. And that was a big problem, was steel on steel trying to run in the winter. And because, as you know, anything at 40 below is as solid ice, is like iron anyway. And so the tram cars wouldn't run. You'd have to have another crew go around and clean up all the tracks and stuff.
Submissions started to come in. They came in from the Moose Jaw Electric Light Company, or electric company. They came in from a firm or an organization in Winnipeg. There was McGregor's. So City Council sat down and began to look at these proposals. So we have the city employees putting together proposals for council on proposed routes, putting together a close analysis of each of these proposals for council. In the final analysis, the McGregor proposal was chosen, and in April 1912, an agreement was signed off with McGregor to accept his contract, his proposal to run the street railway. All of this was thrown up in the air when people came to the realization that the public utilities legislation passed in 1912 by the provincial government required the McGregor proposal, required approval of that proposal by the province as well as the city.
As talks grew of the streetcar project coming off the rails, mounting unrest at a civic level had caused some who had proposed the railway to get cold feet or walk away. That, coupled with looming involvement by the provincial government through new legislation, would threaten to derail the streetcars before residents of the city would have a chance to ride the rails in the luxury and style many had hoped for the cosmopolitan center Brandon was thought to be.
And in the course of dealing with that, McGregor withdrew, and council agreed that they would move ahead with this as a municipally owned operation. The elephant in the room, so to speak, was the Dominion exhibition. This was a national fair held each year in a different center across Canada. And in 1913, it was Brandon's turn to hold the Dominion exhibition. And it was scheduled to begin July 15th, 1913. So the inaugural run, June 2nd, got the street railway in operation, and the first day of the fair, the Brandon Sun proclaimed proudly that 7,000 people used the street railway on the first day of the fair, and it was a terrific success. It took people up to the fairgrounds, and it showed the city off well. It was a modern, urban place with good transportation.
Our next stop was to meet with Brandon's first female mayor, Her Worship Sherry Dector Hurst. The mayor has a keen interest in the history of the city and shared a bit about the politics at play during the time of Brandon's proposed meteoric rise to superiority in the West.
All the headlines we're talking about were more than a small farm town. We're a modern city, and in fact it was growing very quickly. That a streetcar that you would find in Winnipeg, in New York, in Chicago, in Toronto, Brandon wanted that system too, and so it became symbolic and emblematic of progress. Of course, within moments of announcing that the city council announced that they were going to pursue this, the telegrams started coming in from all of the people who would supply the cars and the railroad lines, and some of the backroom deals started to form. Business leaders in the community suddenly were championing their favorite contractor. It went through huge controversy because, of course, the city council of the day had to decide, is it going to be public or is it going to be private? And again, that bounced back and forth as well. The citizens voted to have it private. They didn't want it on their tax rolls. City council, for a variety of reasons, decided to make it publicly owned and then started increasing taxes on it.
Busted and broken by the early 30s, the city had seen its once spectacular rise slow to a crawl. Furthermore, it had been placed under the watchful eye of a public trustee because, by all accounts, it appears the city of Brandon was going bankrupt.
In 1935, or thereabouts, of the 350,000 issued, $272,000 was still owing. And of the 150,000, 145,000 was still owing. So the taxpayers of Brandon were saddled until 1952 with the costs of the street railway. It was a huge white elephant. The issue here really is the assumption that was made when the street railway was constructed. I think anyone who was asked at the time, is the street railway as it exists now a viable proposition? And they would have said no. Because the assumption was that the city was going to expand and expand and expand. That the growth that the city had experienced from 1900 to 1910, when it went from 5,000 people to 13,000 people, was going to continue. If there was one huge step that the city saw the need to take, just sort of to hold your breath and take the decision, it was to build the street railway. Of all of the public utilities that the city invested in, sidewalks, pavements and so on. The street railway was really the most, the sexiest, I suppose, and the one that generated the most excitement.
The one fascinating bit of information about the fleet that rolled the rails in Brandon is none of the rolling stock that once serviced the city still resided there. For the most part, they had been sold off as surplus and became anything from chicken coops to concession stands to apartments and restaurants to, in one particular case, firewood, and the wheel assemblies had been sent for scrap as the value in iron outweighed the historical value in many cases. Truly, I thought this was going to be a dead end to our story, until a bit of internet searching and a phone call one evening connected me with a car hiding far off in a city scrapyard. The call came from a gentleman named Chris Ashdown, the president of the Edmonton Radial Railway Society, and Chris, putting it quite bluntly, said, "We have your car." And in this find I felt we had kicked over the honey jar, envisioning a glorious streetcar ready to roll down the tracks again. All we needed was the steel to roll it on, so in late September we packed our bags for Edmonton, and a reunion with a car I had never met, but it had a story to tell, if we cared to listen. We've traveled over 1,000 kilometers, and we're here in Edmonton, Alberta, the home of the Edmonton Radial Railway Society. I'm here at Fort Edmonton Park, and we're about to go take a look at the last home of the Brandon streetcar. As well, we're going to learn a little bit about radial rail travel, electric streetcars, and how that type of technology has been lost on a current generation. So let's take a look and see what we can find at the Edmonton Radial Railway Society. So here in the Fort Edmonton Park barn, with Chris Ashdown, president of the Edmonton Radial Railway Society, and we're going to take a look at some of the cars. You've got all kinds of date ranges in here. What's probably the oldest car in the barn here right now?
Our oldest car is Edmonton streetcar number 1.
Right.
And it was built in 1908.
Right.
And built by the Ottawa Car Company.
Right. And it's the original streetcar for the city of Edmonton? Or?
Yeah, there was 2 streetcars that were delivered in 1908. Number 2 actually made it to the city a day before number 1 did.
Oh.
But number 1 was the only streetcar that was preserved intact from the streetcar era.
Excellent. Well, can we take a look?
Yeah, let's go in.
Learning that the Brandon streetcars were similar to Car 43 and Car 1 in the Edmonton fleet, we would take some time to learn about how the cars worked, their capacity, and how one would operate technology, in some cases over a century old. Through riding in these cars and talking with some of the long-timers at Fort Edmonton Park, members of the Radial Railway Society would teach us, as well as tinker on the cars from day to day. The society operates solely on volunteer hours and labors of love. We learned from Bill Keith, a member of the team that brought the Brandon car there, that it was a single truck base and would seat in the area of 25 to 30 passengers, similar to the Edmonton cars. The Brandon one, though, did have some unique features, including curved windows and sliding doors, proving some commitment to aesthetic appeal while maintaining a functional size for the city of Brandon. We would get a chance to be the first Brandonites in some time to step into the shell of the car the next day, although it was a bit far from taking it for a spin around the park. As part of the Society's agreement with the City of Edmonton, some of the older cars are stored off-site to manage space for the stock of projects hanging around in the trees. The Brandon car would arrive at the City of Edmonton holding yard in 1994, the place it has sat since moving west. So this is Edmonton number 80?
Yeah.
Very different layout. Different time frame or different period? Or?
Yeah, well, this streetcar is from 1930, and this was one of 5 streetcars that the city ordered in 1930, the last new streetcars ordered in Edmonton. It's built by the Ottawa Car Company, same as streetcar number 1. And this one is an all steel sided streetcar, so quite different. Much nicer seating, leather seats. And this was one of the first streetcars in Edmonton that had a seat for the motorman. Being all steel, it's a much more rigid body, it's quieter, it's got better heating inside. This is all electric heating inside the streetcar. Much nicer car.
Right. Also, again, a real kind of focus on the advertising in here. What about by the door here? Some of the design and especially the markings and that type of thing. Now, is that all redone freehand? Or?
Yeah. We have one of our members is a sign artist, and so he's done a lot of our painting outside, inside the streetcars, labels, and so on.
How long ago did this car come into the collection?
Well, first of all, this car took about 15 years to restore, and it's been operating in the park since 2004.
Right. The team at Ford Edmonton Park does not only restore cars from various Canadian fleets, but they have acquired some unique cars from around the world, including cars from Australia, Germany, Japan, the United States, and one of the crown jewels in the collection, a rare TTC car from Toronto. Some of those old cars still run to this day throughout the city of Toronto, but this is a vintage model, among others, on display at the park in Edmonton. Knowing we were so close to finally seeing the Brandon car, we sat down with Bill Keith. Bill is one of the longest serving members of the Radial Railway Society at Ford Edmonton Park. Bill and a now retired colleague were the ones who were instrumental in bringing the Brandon car to Edmonton, where it is today.
We traveled around the country south of Brandon and found where the two groups of cars were. And we talked a bit to the owners and negotiated after a fashion. And then we talked to one guy, and he was quite happy letting us take bits and pieces off the cars, which we took in Portage and shipped back here. We stopped to look at PCC, which was stored by Winnipeg Transit at that time, and a wooden streetcar and some other artifacts they had, and headed back to the Brandon area, and subsequently asked permission for and gained it to take Brandon car number 6 and bring it back. We had, in fact, the two of us had decided on our own that we should do this. When we got to discuss it, we found we're on the same page. So,
thousands of miles from the last place it would run the rails, we are now mere minutes from the staging area where Brandon number 6 now calls home. We've traveled a long way to get to this point, and the opportunity for us to cross into a piece of our city's history awaits. The fate of the streetcar was largely outside of the community's control at the time, and the legacy of its failure on the city weighs heavy on our history. It should not be undersold, though, that the cars hold a valuable piece of our community's collective heart, and the possibility to bring one of these wounded warriors back home remains in the back of my mind as we peel back the tarp that covers the car from the elements. So we are standing right now in Brandon streetcar number 6, and I'm talking with Chris from the Edmonton Radial Rail Society. Now, obviously, as you mentioned, they're in various levels and stages of repair. Well, how would you grade this one coming in?
I think this streetcar, even in the shape it's in, tells us an awful lot of information. And this is what we're really looking for. We're not expecting to be able to reuse any or most of the wood in here, but we can use this for patterns. We can see the details and how the ceiling was built. Where my hand is on the sides here, we can see where the wires used to go for the buttons for the conductor. We can see where the ads would have gone along the top, along the sides here. So lots of information for us. We can see some of the details of the windows, the parts of the old doors, the exits and entrances for the passengers, and the door for the motorman. They're all still here.
Right. So now, looking at this kind of traditionally, do we have a front and back on this car? Or?
Yeah, this would have been a two-ended streetcar, so controls at both ends. So it could have run on a single track. And then when you got to the end of the line, the motorman would move to the other end. So you have a motorman at one end, and then a conductor at the other end to collect the fares.
So passengers could get on and off on both sides?
Yeah, you'd be using the back right side for entering and exiting, and when you switched ends, you'd have a similar door on the opposite corner of the car.
Right. Looking at a car like this now, we're going to take a look as well at car 33 that is a very similar make to this car. You talked about a little bit about the cost and time investment to a revitalization of it. Can you give us a little bit of insight on 33?
Okay. Streetcar 33 was built in 1912, and it was in service up until 1951. And it was then used as a storage shed on a farm. So when we received it, it was in pretty poor condition. A little bit more than what you see here, but we still had to do a lot of replacement of the wood. So it took us 17 years altogether to complete the restoration work, and 37,000 volunteer hours at a cost of $153,000.
So we're going to take a look now at the back, and they had a unique feature with the sliding windows, and there is actually a sliding window still in here, so we'll go take a look. Now, you had mentioned that, and in your cars, that the windows will actually slide down for free air access in the cars, because obviously there wasn't anything in the way of air conditioning to any great extent. But we still have a functional window here too, for the most part.
Yeah, that's on either side for the motorman. You can open and close these windows so they slide up all the way to the top and then slip in on a piece of wood here to keep them open, or keep them closed and then open them down. So we have it on this side, and we also have one on the opposite side.
Right, and they just be a single pane of glass in there usually?
Just single pane. There's no double pane glass in those days.
Right.
And you can still feel under here, you can see the beadwork, and you can feel where the glass was inside the thing.
So in looking at this car as well, and we talked a little bit, a lot of hardwood used in it. Like it's beyond just slapping something together at that point. There's a lot of art and real quality put into them to build them.
Yeah, the company Niles that built these were a railway coach manufacturer, so they put a lot of detail into their railway coaches, and it did the same with the streetcar.
Right.
So yeah, a lot of hardwood that you wouldn't normally see on a lot of streetcars, a lot of detailed work. Most of the wiring in these streetcars were just two single wires that were run through the car, and just at the top here, there are some old porcelain insulators that would have been used for putting the wires through to the outside for lights on the outside, and so there's a little bit of history right there.
Yeah, they have a fair bit of weight to them too, eh?
Yeah.
You also see a feature that you see in a lot of streetcar construction, where almost every time you see a bit of steel, there's wood right there. Combination of wood and steel all the time. These, you can see there's a sandwich of steel and wood there. Everywhere you look, there's that marrying of the two. So the steel is kind of holding things in shape, and the wood fills in and does the rest of it. That would be one thing we'd be very careful about, getting that shape, preserving that shape. Even though the whole roof might be demolished before it's rebuilt. You get that shape, but you also have the metal where it comes out and relives
right
in the restored car.
It has been a great time learning so much about the history of the street railways across this country, and the hospitality shown by members of the Edmonton Radial Railway Society has been phenomenal. But it appears the boys at the park have something more up their sleeves for our Brandon team. We're headed to downtown Edmonton on a Saturday morning for a ride on the high-level bridge streetcar known as 33. The high-level bridge is a roughly 3-mile stretch of intact streetcar tracks that sprawl from the heart of downtown out across the river towards the location of the University of Alberta campus. Now, this trek along the bridge is not for the faint at heart, as you travel high above the stranded roadway bridge along a railroad tie-track close to a century old. The longtimers from the park tell tales of tying the hydro wires off the edge of the track from a suspended crane bucket, or the time a car broke down halfway across the bridge and they were forced to walk back to the opening along the open-air bridge structure, hundreds of feet in the air. It's an amazing sight from up there, and from the ground you realize the true grasp of how high in the air this car runs. It's truly astounding when you look at where technology has gone, and many modern forms of light rail transit owe their success back to those pioneers of the prairies who tried something bigger than they ever fathomed with the streetcar system and caught the attention of the residents who would make their way through life alongside them. As we started home that Sunday morning, we weren't too far down the road before the phone rang. It was a Westman area farmer I'd been speaking with about what he had thought was a couple of streetcar bodies deep in an overgrown field alongside a frontage road in rural Manitoba. He thought the cars may have been part of the Brandon fleet, but wasn't sure as he had known them to be there since he was young. As the miles brought us closer and closer to home, the drive to take one last swipe at history grew, and the day after arriving back in Brandon, we would hit the road again, this time to a farm near Alexander, Manitoba. Okay, so we've logged a couple thousand kilometers. We've been to Edmonton, Alberta and back. We've talked to people in Brandon. We've talked to people in Edmonton. We have followed these streetcars from start to finish. And we come to the final resting place at 3 Brandon streetcars. Now if we look, obviously there's not much left of any of these cars. Basically just the value of metal. It's sad really to see a piece of Brandon's history come to this. Come to later rest in a field. You know, the fields that were the economy, were the start of the Brandon community. The people that were coming in and doing their commerce and looking after the community and help building their community. It's good we came along these when we did. When we were talking to the farmer, this is the end of the line for them. These 3 streetcars are scheduled to be cut up for scrap metal by the end of October. And we're going to actually see the end of the Brandon Street Railway system some 100+ years from when it began. Kind of fitting really, but sad in the same time. Who knows? Maybe one from Edmonton will run the streets in Brandon again. We'll just have to wait and see.